What's up, nigga? Yeah, motherfucker. Yeah, nigga. What's up, nigga? Yeah, nigga. You's a dead motherfucker now.
As I look up at the sky, my mind starts tripping, a tear drops my eye. My body temperature falls. I'm shaking and they breaking, trying to save the dough. Pumping on my chest and I'm screaming. I stop breathing, damn, I see demons. Dear God, I wonder, can you save me? I can't die, my boo-boo's about to have my baby. I think it's too late for praying. Hold up, her voice spoke to me and it slowly started saying,
bring your lifestyle to me, I'll make it better.
how long will I live?
Eternal life and forever.
Or will I be the G that I want?
Make your life better than you can imagine or even dream of. So relax your soul, let me take control. Close your eyes, my soul.
My eyes are closed.
Was the case that they gave me. Was the case that they gave me.
I'm fresh up off my coma. I got my mama and my daddy and my homies in my corner. It's gonna take a miracle, they say, for me to walk again, to talk again. But anyway, I get fronted some keys to get back on my feet. And everything that nigga said came to reality. Living like a baller, low, having money and blowing hella chronic smoke. I bought my mama a Benz and bought my boo-boo a Jag. And now I'm rolling in a 9-Trends AL dog rag.
Just remember who changed your mind, cause when you start set tripping, that ass is mine.
Indeed, agree, proceed to smoke weed. Never have a want, never have a need. They say I'm greedy, but I still want more. Cause my eyes want a journey to more. Really though.
Check it out.
I'll lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord, my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord, my soul to take.
No more endo, gin and juice. I'm on my way to Chino's, rolling on the Grey Goose. Shackle from head to toe. 25 with an Izzel with nowhere to gizzo. I know them niggas from the other side recognize my face, cause it's the OG Eagle double G LBC. Mad dogging nigga, cause I don't care. Red jumpsuit with 2 braids in my hair. Niggas stare as I enter the center. They send me to a level 3 yard. That's where I stay late night. I hear toothbrushes scraping on the floor. Niggas getting they shanks just in case the war pops off. Cause you can't tell what's next. My little homie, baby boo, took a pencil in his neck. And he probably won't make it to C22. I put that on my mama. I'ma ride for you, baby boo.
Was the case that they gave me. Was the case that they gave me. Was the case that they gave me. Murder was the case that they gave me.
For the team, took a bullet for the dream that we would one day all be free, free from prejudice, free from sexism, free from bigotry. I die for creativity, yeah. I die for freedom to be free. I died and left a legacy. Oh, but baby, I still live through technology. The sun will start shining.
What is going on? What is going on? What is going on, everyone? Hello, 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 and welcome to yet another live here on BubzDaGawd. I hope that you all are having a wonderful Monday afternoon slash evening whenever you're listening to this. And we are back with part two. And like I said, maybe I need to create, I feel like I've already done that, but a fear series because in my opinion, it is fear that prevents us from moving forward. I'm learning that personally in my own life. I still have my own fears that I'm trying to transcend within myself, fears that were taught to me, fears that I also gave my power to. Okay. But now that I'm learning to love myself, to heal from previous experiences, I'm beginning to have a more objective, universal outlook on things. And the more that I do it, I ain't gonna hold you, the more scary it becomes because the world we live in, or shall I say, I'll just keep it in America. The society that we live in today, the country that we live in today is very, very fear-based. That is what is driving all of us, unfortunately, is fear. Fear is a part of the human experience. It is meant to be a bridge. It is meant to be a conduit from you so that you can rise and ascend. But it is us not going through the fear that keeps us in these destructive patterns. And one of the destructive patterns is toxic patriarchy and masculinity. Okay? I want to preface this by saying this. Masculinity within itself is not negative. You need masculinity because that is a part of the human experience. In my opinion, and from the opinions of other people who are mystics, who are spiritualists, those who really understand the spirit, understand, okay, and try to help other people understand that it is both masculine and feminine energy that needs to come together, that needs to complement each other in an aligned way in order for us to live our best life. But because of the culture we live in that has taught us, especially for men, that men are not supposed to be emotional, that emotionality is something weak, it is something that can get you fucked up, when really it's the missing piece to the whole entire situation. That's why I think there's so much feminine energy today, because there is a recalibration. There has to be some sort of balancing that's happening. And today, with part two, we're going to be talking about, again, toxic patriarchy and masculinity. And as you can see on the screen, it reads, Conquer Everything. And the videos that I will be using, or the information that I will be sharing today, is once again from another amazing content creator who every time they upload something, I'm on it. Like, it's just so amazing to me. Just the time, effort, energy, the research, the scholastic involvement in trying to break it down in the most layman's of terms. That YouTuber is the Renegade Cut. Both links to the videos that I will be using will be in the description box below in case you want to go see it for yourself. And I encourage you to go over there and to subscribe to his channel, because again, he's bringing awareness and I really appreciate it. And we'll be using that today in this live to help dilute the fear and to bring more awareness. Okay, but before we jump into that, where are we at? Boom, here we go. Copyright disclaimer. Under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by a copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay? Now, again, there will be two videos that I will share with you all, and I probably won't be talking as much and pausing as much because there's a lot of information here, and I want y'all to digest the information. Again, you don't have to take the Renegade's Cut's word for it, my word for it. Study to show yourself approved as well. And once you educate yourself and you have an understanding of how toxic patriarchy and toxic masculinity is destroying a lot of our human experiences, there's toxic femininity too that is also just a response to the toxic patriarchy. So it's a lot to work out, but we're going to try to work it out, okay? And then at the end, I have a question for all men, those who believe in toxic patriarchy and masculinity, those who operate in it, and those who do not. It is a question to all men in this society, okay? So with that being said, we're going to get into the first part, which talks about the hierarchies, okay? And it kind of gives more of an extensive breakdown of what toxic patriarchy is. And then we're going to delve into toxic masculinity, which is a byproduct of toxic patriarchy. Okay, so this is going to be a lengthy live, as it always is here on BubzDaGawd. Make sure you got your smokes together, your drinks together. You can be listening to this while you're doing something else. I have a voice that you can listen to while you're doing other things, okay? I really want to tap into your subconscious mind more so than anything. So listen to this. And try to internalize it as much as you can. If you have any opinions, thoughts, perspectives that you would like to share, please put them in the comment section below. All opinions and perspectives are welcomed, even though there might be some ignorant ones. That's fine. We have to be truthful and honest before we can get to the objective truth. Okay? So with that being said, let's get into part one, which is the hierarchies of toxic patriarchy. Let's get in.
Video contains discussions about sexual violence. If you believe this would likely trigger a negative psychological episode, please stop the video now. Welcome to my mini-series, The Enforcement of Hierarchies. Before watching this video, I recommend first watching the introductory video. It lays out all the basics and necessary terms. The link is in the video and beneath the video in the description. Let's begin. Many corners of the Western world are in the midst of a reactionary movement, a right-wing groundswell of populist support for reversing recent emancipatory, egalitarian victories. Although some of these victories, either legal or cultural, have occurred in the 21st century, the seeds of this reactionary movement were planted in the beginning of the century. In 2001, the United States was attacked, the motive predominantly related to U.S. foreign policy and economic interests in the Middle East. Nationalism increased in the United States, and its allies took notice. Nationalism from within an occupied or oppressed nation seeking emancipation from a colonizing nation or oppressor nation can be useful for revolutionary purposes, but nationalism from within an oppressor nation serves no function except to isolate the nation, foster xenophobia, and set the nation down the path to fascism, far-right ultranationalism that relies on a mythic past. This nationalism was adopted by the predominant culture, white Christians, and enforced by the state. In the case of the former, white Christians participated in the rise of bigotry against Muslims and xenophobia against immigrants. In the case of the latter, the George W. Bush administration granted the state more surveillance power through the Patriot Act, formed a new executive branch called the Department of Homeland Security, and engaged in a project of expansion into the Middle East and surrounding nations to secure long-sought-after economic interests in the region. This was propagandized as the War on Terror. This interventionist campaign resulted in an enormous amount of displacement. Refugees with nowhere else to go traveled to Europe and North America into the arms of the nations that were responsible for their displacement in the first place. A rapid influx of immigration stoked further nationalism, particularly because the refugees and immigrants were often of a different ethnicity or religion. The 2008 economic crash created the greatest crisis of capitalism since the Great Depression. An economic collapse sends people searching for scapegoats. In the United States, the election of the first black president was seen as a victory against the hierarchy of white supremacy, but it also fostered a new white supremacist reactionary movement. This reactionary movement did not require much coaxing into existence because of the cultural shift during the previous administration and the aforementioned economic crash that began immediately prior to the Barack Obama administration. Those predisposed to hierarchical politics connected this economic downfall with the new president, even though he was not in power during the crash. A weapon used against Obama was the conspiracy theory that he was a secret Muslim, as if that alone were disqualifying. The Syrian civil war, provoked by powerful nations with investments in the region, furthered the influx of refugees into an already nationalistic Europe and North America. In the United Kingdom, this nationalism allowed the popularization of Brexit, and in mainland Europe, this nationalism allowed for the popularization of dormant fascist politics and parties. Scapegoating Muslims and immigrants fired up the right, pushing them further and further, setting other marginalized groups in their sights. If one social hierarchy is threatened, all social hierarchies are threatened. A cultural position or political position does not exist in a vacuum. It is influenced by broader cultural beliefs and political ideologies. A shift to the right on one issue will open the door to other issues as the popularity of the ideology responsible for the popular shift gains more cultural relevance and political power. Fascist political parties and charismatic strongmen emerged to spread insecurity to those at the top of social hierarchies about the looming threat to their position on those hierarchies. They promised to enforce social hierarchies. Those who were already predisposed to this kind of thinking bought into this promise. The emergence of fascist groups was deeply connected to not only reactionism and social hierarchy in general, but to patriarchy specifically. The most populous fascist group in the United States is the Proud Boys. It was also the most populous fascist group in Canada, its nation of origin, until membership was criminalized in 2021. This neo-fascist organization has the most restrictive recruitment policies, men only, and the highest number of members. In order for this contradictory statement to be true, the men-only aspect of the Proud Boys must be highly appealing to its potential recruits, not to mention its explicit patriarchal dogma. This reactionary movement was not only happening in the streets and social media, but in high political office and the courts. In 2016, shortly before the presidential election, then-candidate Donald Trump was exposed as someone who would speak of women as objects, joke about assaulting them, and otherwise mistreat them. Trump's history of credible accusations of sexual assault was also highlighted. Trump also went further than the average pro-life politician, stating that not only must there be criminal consequences for practitioners of abortion, but the women who seek them. Any of these incidents should have been disqualifying from office, or at least that's what common wisdom told us. Nevertheless, all three revelations were dismissed in a matter of days. The Access Hollywood scandal broke around 4 p.m. Eastern Time on October 7th. Mere hours later, an enormous amount of men accepted his excuse of locker room banter, a euphemism for vulgar dehumanization of women among men who subscribe to hierarchical, traditionalist gender roles. The accusations of sexual misconduct never caught fire among men who view such accusations with an unreasonable amount of skepticism. Trump's reinvention of himself as the strongest pro-life candidate was embraced by his own party, by that point closing in on the challenge to Roe v. Wade. Trump was elected president, emboldening his adherents and annihilating the common wisdom that such a man could never be elected president. Prior to the election, the efforts of then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell delayed a Supreme Court nomination that could have upset the balance of the highest court in the nation. When Trump was elected, only then was Antonin Scalia's replacement allowed a hearing, previously Merrick Garland under Obama, and then the eventual Justice Neil Gorsuch under Trump. During the administration, Anthony Kennedy retired from his position. He was replaced by a far less qualified and more conservative Republican, Brett Kavanaugh. When a credible accusation of rape was made against Kavanaugh by a highly respectable woman, the accusation was adamantly opposed by Trump's party, and the woman was denounced as a liar. By that point, the Republican Party now had sufficient evidence that patriarchy was a feature and not a bug for their voters. The common wisdom started to fade away. They did not fear much reprisal. The passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg allowed Trump another Supreme Court nomination, this time Amy Coney Barrett, another pro-lifer. The plot to overturn Roe v. Wade began shortly after it went into effect, but the opportunity did not present itself until 2022. A combination of bad timing and political machinations have given an unbreakable conservative majority to the most hierarchical concentration of power in the United States, the Supreme Court. 9 unelected justices are given lifetime appointments to decide many of the most important debates of our time. We can expect the Supreme Court to lay down rulings that enforce social hierarchies. The court's decision in Ardoin v. Robinson on June 21st may reestablish the right to racially gerrymander a state in favor of the white majority, limit the influence of black voters, and further the hierarchy of white supremacy. The decision was a mere 1 page long and provided no substantive explanation, for none could possibly hold up to scrutiny. The court's decisions in Kennedy v. Bremerton School District and Carson v. Macon come close to annihilating the separation of church and state altogether, violating the Establishment Clause of the United States Constitution and reasserting the hierarchy of Christian supremacy. The most right-wing Supreme Court in modern history has also signaled it wishes to strike down Obergefell v. Hodges, the decision that granted marriage equality, and Lawrence v. Texas, the decision that legalized same-sex relations in the 14 states that still had such discriminatory laws on the books. Returning to abortion, the Supreme Court's decision on Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization has overturned Roe v. Wade, triggering immediate bans on abortion in some states, upholding significant restrictions in others, with many more statewide bans expected in the coming weeks and months following state legislation. Although reproductive rights have historically been seen as a matter of women's autonomy, it should be noted that trans men and non-binary people who were assigned female at birth can also seek an abortion. The right generally ignores this and historically was unaware of this, but this new information does not change their calculus on this matter. To the right, trans men are not men. To the right, non-binary people do not exist. To the right, the fact that this decision also directly harms many trans people is something not to be considered, but something either to be ignored or celebrated. Although some individual pro-lifers might see this as a moral or religious issue and may not be able to be convinced otherwise, to those in power, restricting abortion is at least partially about control. It is inescapable because social hierarchies enforce control, the control of those lower on the hierarchy. This is about the hierarchy of patriarchy. What is patriarchy? How did it come to be? And why does it still exist today?
All right, so he kind of prefaced everything by using some very recent examples, even though I think this video is like maybe a year or 2 years old, around that time frame, but still the message, unfortunately, is still the same. So we have more of a realistic, contemporary, recent events of, again, the octopi-ass hands of toxic patriarchy, which is about control. Being able to have the power, the supreme power, the unchecked power, the beyond reproached power. Okay, so it wants to be able to control everyone else's lives, but doesn't want to include itself under that same thing. And it affects, again, oppressed groups of people. It affects women as far as them having control and autonomy over their body. It also controls the lives of queer people like myself who one day aspire to marriage and having a family and just existing as a queer person. And also for people who are African American or people of color who have fought for centuries to have equality just for toxic patriarchy to try to reverse that. Again, affirmative action has been stricken down, even though affirmative action benefited white women and it was created for white women, honestly, and not for the people who really need to benefit from it. Okay, we have all these anti-queer laws that are being put into place now, and I think 74 of them have been enacted already. Look at Florida, and we already seen what happened with women's rights. These continual conversations about the other groups of people's expressions, and existence in America. So he gave us a preface of that so that you have a general idea that's more recent. You know what I'm saying? Now we're going to get into what is and is not patriarchy, okay? Because I'm pretty sure people are going to have questions. Whenever patriarchy is brought up, I've seen conversations, especially on black panels with black men, and whenever women or queer men come into the conversation to talk about patriarchy, they say, oh, well, what is patriarchy? I don't know what patriarchy is, and y'all saying the patriarchy and all this stuff. So now in section 1, we're going to get a scholastic, okay, researched, okay, overwhelming evidence of what is and is not patriarchy. So let's get into it.
Patriarchy is both a widely understood concept in academics, but a narrowly understood concept by laymen. People, particularly men, commonly misunderstand the word patriarchy and even become defensive when the word is used. Because of this, any definition of what patriarchy is must be accompanied by an explanation of what patriarchy is not. This misunderstanding is furthered in modern times by a searchable definition that is inaccurate and unclear, with its first result a reference to patrilineality, or the male lineage in families, instead of patriarchy. These are related terms but describe different systems, and are not the same. Patriarchy is more than sexism. Sexism is discrimination based on sex. Patriarchy is more than misogyny. Misogyny is a contempt for or mistrust of women. Patriarchy is a social system in which men are granted greater privileges than people of other genders, historically women. Patriarchy is a hierarchy of...
Or from a spiritual standpoint, to kind of expound off of that, favoring more so masculine energy and what they believe masculine energy is, and literally suppressing feminine energy from women and from queer people, especially other queer men.
genders in which men are given special, exclusive social status, a hierarchy that advantages men and disadvantages other genders. It is enforced by learned cultural practices, pervasive ideas, implicit bias, and sometimes laws, but it is not solely one of those components. A society is comprised of a network of social systems. Thus, it would be appropriate to call a society patriarchal as well. According to Alan G. Johnson, author of The Gender Knot, what is patriarchy? A society is patriarchal to the degree that it promotes male privilege by being male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. It is also organized around an obsession with control and involves as one of its key aspects the oppression of women. Patriarchy is not a way of saying men. Patriarchy refers not to me or any other man or collection of men, but to a kind of society in which men and women participate.
So this is already a bigger thing. And he's right. We all play into patriarchy. There are sometimes, even with me, the way that I view certain things, I'm still learning how to let go of toxic patriarchy so that I can be more inclusive and be more understanding. I think my queer experience has helped me to become more balanced with my divine masculine and my divine feminine. But that is true. It's in a society where men are privileged. They have a greater range of things than women could. That's why whenever women or queer men are in areas or spaces that is quote unquote male dominated, and they come in and they end up doing it twice as better because they have to work twice as hard. Now it's a problem, it's an issue, they can't be a part of it. A lot of bullshit. Okay? So we just now have a scholastic definition of what patriarchy is. Again, people have their own opinion and belief. I'm just going off of, I stand strongly with this opinion because to me, it seems the most intellectually honest and correct. Okay, and like he said before he started part 1, which is, when it comes down to patriarchy, a lot of men don't understand it as far as laymen. The everyday man may not understand that, or they've been taught that whenever someone says patriarchy or toxic masculinity, they become defensive. Again, I have seen black men ask questions and become defensive on patriarchy on Black Men Unfiltered. I've heard Lance Scurv get upset when taxing patriarchy and masculinity. Like a lot of these black men feel upset when we bring these things up, and they don't even have a comprehensible understanding about it. And it's so funny to me because if I'm not mistaken, women, especially black women out of the black community, are the most educated than black men. So I don't know. What's up, King Anubis? I hope all is well. I had looked at your page yesterday. I was like, I gotta message him soon, cause I wonder how you doing. I know we living our lives, doing our own thing, but I hope that all is well with you, King. What's up, boy? Crazy? What's going on? And just so y'all know, we're gonna be here for a minute, okay? Cause we're getting first the scholastic and historical information about toxic patriarchy, and then we're going to get into toxic masculinity, and then again I have my question for all men, especially black men. Okay, so again, make sure y'all got y'all smokes together, y'all drinks. Again, you can listen to this while you're doing something else. That's perfectly fine. I have a background voice. I'm okay with that, because the background voice usually gets into your subconscious mind. That's what I want to do. Okay, let's continue.
Some men hear patriarchy and defensively think it means men, and some men hear patriarchy and identify with its values, if not its name, and do not want to face the possibility of giving up male privilege. We need to be strong and get past the discomfort of talking about patriarchy, and know there is no gentler word that will act as a spoonful of sugar to make this medicine go down, because the so-called gentler words like sexism do not accurately describe this social system.
Thank you,
and
boy,
serve
crazy.
instead to ignore patriarchy as a system and reduce it to the occasional bad actions of individuals. What is a social system? A social system can refer to the more intangible concept itself, but in sociological terms, a social system is a patterned series of interrelationships existing between individuals, groups, and institutions, forming a coherent whole. Small social customs can form a social system that is pervasive. Here's an example of a social custom that is comparatively more innocuous than those that make up patriarchy: the dynamics of greeting people. When two or more people meet, there are a number of customs and social boundaries. Informality is usually reserved for unarranged or unexpected meetings. Formality is usually reserved for arranged or expected meetings. This informality and formality can also vary depending on the setting and circumstances.
Okay, so it says here, informal meeting, unarranged, spontaneous, unexpected, no handshake, it's a short greeting, names might not be used. In a formal meeting, which is arranged, planned, and expected, there is a handshake. There's a longer greeting, and names will definitely be used. And variations exist depending on the setting and culture. Example, bowing instead of shaking hands. Okay?
Now, this all sounds cold and technical for something as usually warm and organic as greeting someone, but these greetings do not happen by some innate faculty. The polite way to meet people is not an accident of instinct, nor is it enforced by a governing body of Ann Landers and Dear Abby. It is a social system in which we participate, and is enforced not by law, but by culture. We don't learn it in a class, and that's why this sounds overly technical. We learn it through exposure.
Exactly.
Remember that word, it will be important later. Adherence to a well-known social system is not necessarily due to personal conscious agreement with this social system. Instead, adherence to a well-known social system is simply the path of least resistance. Again from The Gender Knot by Alan G. Johnson. Participation in social systems shapes our behaviors through paths of least resistance, a concept that refers to a feature of social systems that guides the conscious and unconscious choices we make from one moment to the next. Another way to explain it beyond the path of least resistance is incentives and disincentives. Men are incentivized by pre-existing male-centered culture to conform to patriarchal standards and adopt a patriarchal outlook. Men are disincentivized to do the opposite. Women, too, can be incentivized to conform to these standards, as opposing these standards results in admonishment and shame, often public shame. More on this later. Patriarchy is not a series of laws, Laws can help enforce patriarchy, enforce the social system, but patriarchy as a social system can, and does, exist outside mere legislation. Patriarchy is also enforced culturally, socially. When the subject of patriarchy comes up in conversation in so-called Western nations, people in that conversation sometimes state that patriarchy might exist, but only in those other nations. However, this distinction between those other nations and Western nations is not relevant. That is not to say that the pervasiveness and harshness of patriarchy as a social system is identical across cultures. It is only to say that patriarchy as a social system exists across cultures. Studies of intelligence consistently show virtually identical capacity between genders, and even in rare studies that show mild variation in individual subjects, greater context and further study ends up showing parity, not disparity, when controlling for socioeconomic factors and cultural biases. The bias of patriarchy, of the male-centered society, is among the most significant factors in why women are not chosen for important positions in politics, religion, and business. This exclusion has little, if anything, to do with performance or intelligence, and almost everything to do with implicit bias. There is explicit bias against women, of course, but there is also an implicit bias to exclude women due to the male-centered society. An implicit bias is not a conscious decision. It is automatic, unintentional, and involuntary.
And it reads, implicit bias, an unconscious favoritism that occurs automatically and unintentionally. An implicit bias is learned through exposure and affects behaviors, decisions, judgments, and perceptions.
An implicit bias is learned through exposure.
Oh, you already read it again, twice.
In this case, exposure to the male-centered society. According to research by Harvard University, New York University, and the University of Denver, this implicit bias is widespread. Researchers asked more than 3,600 people, both adults and children, from over 70 nations if they believed that men were smarter than women. They claimed that they did not. However, when the participants were tested over the course of 5 separate studies, between 60% and 75% showed evidence of an implicit bias that associates brilliance with men more than women. Major studies have focused on this bias specifically, removing the excuse that this exclusion can be attributed to performance. Researchers from Cornell University and New York University recruited 347 people and asked them to refer acquaintances for a job. Half read a description that emphasized the candidate requiring a high IQ or superior reasoning skills and natural intelligence. The other half read a description that emphasized the candidate being highly motivated. When recommending someone for the job that required brilliance, participants referred women approximately 38% less than men. When the researchers performed the study a second time to see if this was some isolated result, they increased the participants to 811. The bias was lower, but participants still recommended women approximately 20% less than men. Nothing to do with performance in the job because the job is hypothetical. This is exclusively due to bias.
Wow.
This perception is essentially imagined, but this imagined perception is still widespread. Studies also show that men are far more likely to rate themselves as more intelligent than average, whereas women have a more accurate view of their intelligence. When studies also test their intelligence after their estimation, the men and women scored about the same, but the men's results were much lower than their inflated, inaccurate estimations. Where does this implicit bias begin? People begin to be affected by the bias at a young age when formative ideas begin to shape their perceptions for the rest of their lives. Studies show that due to the male-centered society, children begin to conform to the patriarchal view of the world by age 6 or 7. A study of 400 children showed that around age 5, when told a story about a brilliant person, the child assigned that person their own gender. However, children age 6 and 7, having been exposed to more of the male-centered society, assumed that the brilliant person in the story was a man in much higher numbers.
Wow. So when children who were not exposed to, like he said, dominant male spaces in society, they came up with their own gender. They came up with their own idea of what they believed brilliance was. So they had more of a genuine, natural, organic viewpoint to see what that is. But when they were taught stories, like he said, 6 and 7, and being introduced into male-dominated spaces and areas, and unfortunately, in this culture, men are on top of everything. They're the apex. They're all these things. These children thought that men were more brilliant than women. And I'll give you an example of how that's not always the case. Because there are some men who are brilliant. But to say that all men are brilliant is farce. When I used to work at K&G, which is a suit store, all of the people who were the store managers and the key holders and managers by far were women. They were all women. And the regional manager at the time, who is a complete asshole, he would get praise and recognition for all these different ideas, but these ideas did not come from him. Hold on one second. Sorry, I had to get that background noise together. It was my sister. But all the ideas that he quote unquote had came from the store manager, who was a female. The regional manager didn't have a fucking idea what to do about the situation. Of course, the store manager at the time, who is a black woman, came up with the answer. He took her answer and applied it to show his higher-ups that he's doing the work, and he got all the recognition and the praise, and she ain't get a damn thing. What the fuck?
This was true even among young girls. This implicit bias affects everything. Everything a woman says, every opinion a woman has, every accomplishment a woman achieves is reduced and marginalized because of an implicit bias in patriarchal society that triggers a response in our minds that devalues the intelligence of women. When men assess women, the assessment exists in an almost parallel reality in which the exact same behaviors or qualities are described with completely different words and completely different connotations. Men are assertive, whereas women are bossy. Men are confident, whereas women are difficult. A man can be young or mature, whereas women can only be immature or old, respectively. In short, those who deny the cultural and social disadvantages of women claim that there is only a perception of disadvantage due to some genetic component or inherent inferiority, since we know with great certainty that 1. Women are as intellectually capable as men, and 2. Implicit bias definitely exists on some level. We have no choice but to acknowledge the cultural, social explanations, instead of some ridiculous notion of genetic inferiority. We have no choice but to acknowledge.
Let's read this. Let me remove. Is this? Hold on. Let me remove this thing real quick so I can read that one part. Where's it at? This overlay. Okay. It says nearly all studies independently conclude that gender does not have a significant impact on intelligence or is that capacity? Move this out the way. This logo. Yeah, capacity. There we go. Nearly all studies independently conclude that implicit bias against women and in favor of men both exist and is pervasive. Women in fewer positions of authority in society cannot be traced to intelligence or capacity and must be traced to this implicit bias, and this gendered privilege creates a hierarchy of genders, and if men are given privilege at the apex of this hierarchy, this social system is best described as patriarchy.
Patriarchy. We have eliminated the impossible and must now face reality. To do otherwise would be intellectually dishonest.
Yeah.
2 notes of
There's a
clarification.
lot of that shit going on.
First, the tests of intelligence are not mere IQ tests in all studies. Intelligence quotient tests have been criticized for reliability and racial bias. The gender parity of intelligence is a conclusion of a battery of tests, including academic scores, as well as endless psychological studies, but producing similar results. Second, the comparative intelligence studies simply disprove patriarchal notions about the inferiority of women and disprove the denials of the existence of patriarchy. Even if women were, on average, less intelligent or less capable than men, it still would not justify their mistreatment. Human rights should not be granted only after proving academic excellence. We all have human rights, regardless of comparative intelligence and capacity. No decent human being should believe that an individual with a B+ in freshman algebra should be enslaved by an individual who got an A-. Virtually identical intelligence is only meaningful to prove that there must be a different reason why women are in fewer positions of authority and success. That reason is patriarchy. Later in the video, there will be more on why this implicit bias exists in the first place. Patriarchy is not some conspiracy of men or a myth conjured up by women. Instead, it is a social system in which all genders participate, but with only one gender at the apex of the hierarchy. Much like the more innocuous handshake example, people operating within this social system are simply following the path of least resistance, and they are often doing so unconsciously. Changing a dynamic requires more resistance. So, how did all of this get started? If patriarchy is a social system that is passed to people and propagates itself through social interaction and exposure, when was the first interaction?
Now here we go. We just got again a more comprehensible, factual, scholastic, academia understanding of what it is. All of the misconceptions, all of the misinformation that is spread through the ego, all of the intellectual dishonesty that happens. We've already dealt with those questions and have diluted and answered those questions. So now there should be no reason for ignorance. But to continue to strengthen the argument of how toxic patriarchy is destructive to our society. Okay, because it just believes that one group of people are better than others, when factually, statistically, we see that's not the case. We're equal. Hello. But now we're going to learn the origins, okay, the beginnings of patriarchy, okay? So once again, get y'all smokes together, get y'all drinks together if you haven't already. Listen to this while you're doing something else, because I want you to comprehend what is being said to you. And again, don't take the Renegade's Cut's word for it. Don't take my word for it. Go study to show thyself approved. Let's get into section 2.
A warning. Although this video already contained a content warning in the beginning, I wish to reiterate that here, as the next section relates to sexual violence. I am, like most people, extremely uncomfortable talking about this. Nevertheless, it is inescapable when discussing this particular topic, and to not do so would invalidate the overall argument and explanation. Let's begin. Anthropologists, historians, sociologists, and other academics who devote their lives to the studies of who we are and why have a number of well-supported theories about the origins of patriarchy. Although there are competing theories, there is less of a conflict and more of a collaboration that builds one theory on top of the other. For example, in the 19th century work, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Friedrich Engels theorized that the appropriation of women's bodies was the result of the creation of private property, and that this appropriation continued for centuries, eventually under capitalism. However, later 20th century works, such as The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner, theorized that it is more likely that this appropriation was a foundational feature in the creation of private property and the state. Engels was on the right track, but his conception of the origins of patriarchy and private property was inverted. Much of what we consider patriarchy today had its origins in scarcity, the exchange of women, and ownership of women as the first institutionalized form of slavery.
Wow.
According to anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss, author of The Elementary Structures of Kinship, the system of the scarce product constitutes an extremely general model. In this and many other cases, these periods of crisis, to which until recently our society was so unaccustomed, merely re-establish in a crucial form a state of affairs regarded as virtually normal in primitive society. Women feed the pigs, relatives lend them to one another, and the villages exchange them for women. The total relationship of exchange, which constitutes marriage, is not established between a man and a woman, but between two groups of men, and the woman figures only as one of the objects in the exchange, not as one of the partners.
And now that I think about it, how this patriarchy benefits this system, like it said, it sees everything as property. Something to conquer, something to own that doesn't have any value unless the one that owns it gives it value. Not only with women, not only with the history of slavery with black people, but learning how to monopolize on every aspect of our lives, to control everything. And when I think of a lot of black men, not all, but a lot of black men who are vocal today, they always talk about women being submissive, and if you can't verbally get them to be submissive, you can forcefully make them submissive. And we see that same talking point and that same argument being brought up in a lot of the black manosphere today about women being unruly, women not having any control over themselves. But when they say that, they say in the means of, oh, you don't have a man who can control you, who can whip your ass into shape and whip your ass into what a woman should be. Again, catering to toxic patriarchy. That if a woman does not have a man in her life, she will be led astray. But we are learning right now scholastically the origins of patriarchy. And once again, it being used as something to control others. So it's a very interesting, but yet destructive timeline that's happening here. Let's continue further.
Men eventually were exchanged through the broader institution of slavery, spanning thousands of years. But in primitive society, why were women exchanged first? Sexual dimorphism is the condition of sexes having different physical characteristics, some directly related to reproduction and some not. Cisgender men, on average, are taller than cisgender women. The former also usually has broader shoulders than the latter. Men had, on average, greater capacity to enforce violence on women than women had capacity to enforce violence on men. According to Gerda Lerner, women would be more easily coerced, most likely by rape. Once married or mothers of children, they would give loyalty to their children and to their children's relatives, and would thus make a potentially strong bond with the tribe of affiliation. This was, in fact, the way slavery developed historically. Early civilizations developed under specialized conditions: proximity to water, proximity to other resources, etc. Intertribal conflicts arose from resource scarcity. By the time these early nation-states were developed, the exchange and slavery of women had already been established in various tribal proto-societies. The broadness of shoulders and other sexual dimorphic characteristics led to greater private property ownership of those practicing early agriculture. Sexual dimorphism did not make men greater than women, but some of their physical characteristics lent themselves toward one being able to violently control the other. Rape was eventually criminalized, but usually not to protect women. The eventual criminalization of rape was developed as a property crime to protect men and their property.
Wow. Listen to what he just said. The whole thing about grape, take the G off, and what he said was not meant to protect women. It was meant to protect the property of men, and the property of men are women. That's why a lot of black men, not all, but a lot of black men want to use their fist. They even bring up the Bible to talk about how they should use their fist to... That's why I say education is important. Like, these people are not educating themselves on the history of these things. Like the quote says, if you don't know your history, you're like a leaf that does not know it's a part of a damn tree.
Women. According to Susan Brownmiller, author of Against Our Will, a female definition of rape can be contained in a single sentence. If a woman chooses not to have intercourse with a specific man, and the man chooses to proceed against her will, that is a criminal act of rape. Through no fault of woman, this is not, and never has been, the legal definition.
Wow.
The ancient patriarchs who came together to write their early covenants had used the rape of women to forge their own male power.
Wow.
How then could they see rape as a crime of man against woman? Women were wholly owned subsidiaries and not independent beings. Rape could not be envisioned as a matter of female consent or refusal, nor could a definition acceptable to males be based on a male-female understanding of a female's right to her bodily integrity. Rape entered the law through the back door, as it were, as a property crime of man against man. Woman, of course, was viewed as the property. To enforce patriarchy, those in power developed laws and strategies to maintain power, such as the refusal to allow women positions of authority, refusal to allow women positions in religious practices, and refusal to allow women education or literacy. Again, there is no actual documented difference between the intelligence of men and women, only the historic practice of denying women higher education until very recently, and still only in some parts of the world. In Meno, Plato wrote, "A woman's virtue may also be easily described. Her duty is to order her house, and keep what is indoors, and obey her husband." Even in progressive Athens, women's education was limited to only rudimentary knowledge. In the Roman Empire, a woman would have the responsibility of teaching her male children, but once of age, that responsibility was taken from her. As time went on, Roman women could sometimes receive higher education, but this was exceptional, not the most standard practice. Even though Roman women's education was limited in numbers, Roman men still lamented this marginal amount of equality. In a dialogue on oratory, Tacitus wrote, "Every citizen's son, the child of a chaste mother, was from the beginning reared, not in the chamber of a purchased nurse, but in that mother's bosom and embrace, and it was her special glory to study her home and devote herself to her children." These attitudes continued throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and well into the 20th century all over the world. After India gained its independence in 1947, literacy among women was less than 9%. Reforms were made, but even by the 1980s, the majority of women were not taught to read. Today, the majority of women in India can read, but only approximately 70% as opposed to 85% of the men. It was not until the 1980s before China passed a new educational law that guaranteed educational rights until at least middle school. Only decades prior, just 20% of young girls were enrolled in elementary school. To this day, there is a large portion of the world that is illiterate, and there is a noticeable disparity between male and female literacy due to laws, discouragement, and intimidation. In the United States, gender discrimination in education was not banned until 1972 with the passage of Title IX, at least in terms of schools that receive funding from the federal government. Gender discrimination in education still exists, of course, but is done surreptitiously or through implicit bias. Summarizing multiple studies, Professor Joseph Simpian explained, "When faced with a boy and a girl of the same race and socioeconomic status who performed equally well on math tests, and whom the teacher rated equally well in behaving and engaging with school, the teacher rated the boy as more mathematically able, an alarming pattern that replicated in a separate data set collected over a decade later. Another way of thinking of this is that in order for a girl to be rated as mathematically capable as her male classmate, she not only needed to perform as well as him on a psychometrically rigorous external test, but also be seen as working harder than him. Let's move on to voting rights. Women's suffrage, the right for...
And even when people work harder, girl, and work twice as hard and 3 times as hard and 4 times as hard, it's still not honored.
For women to vote is only a recent development compared to the history of democracy. The first territory to continuously allow women to vote was the Pitcairn Islands in 1838. A handful of provinces and territories continued this experiment, but not a single sovereign nation allowed women to vote until 1913 in Norway. France did not have women's suffrage until 1944. Switzerland did not allow women to vote at the federal level until 1971. Spain did not re-establish women's right to vote until 1977, Liechtenstein in 1984. The United States is a peculiar case. Although a constitutional amendment granted women the right to vote in 1920, many states did not allow black people of any gender to vote until 1965. The right to vote for women is a fairly recent development and not one that has been achieved worldwide. There are obstacles and intimidation. This, combined with the implicit bias, fills political offices predominantly with men. In 2021, a record percentage of women served in the 117th Congress in the United States, but that record percentage was still only 27%. This is common throughout the world. As of September 2021, there were 26 women serving as heads of state or heads of government in 24 nations. There are 195 nations, give or take a recognition or two. That means there are 171 nations that do not have a woman head of state or head of government. Put more simply, 24 nations out of 195 nations is only about 12%.
But whenever we have woman king, all of a sudden it's a problem? Wow.
The right to vote has not created equality in political power. Why is this? Part of the reason is the aforementioned implicit bias, even among other women. Further, men may be encouraged to vote by other men, whereas women may be discouraged to vote by men, either explicitly or implicitly by giving women lives that revolve around a support position to men. Men see politics as their realm, power as their realm. Young men are seen as bright and encouraged to run for office, whereas young women of comparable intelligence and capacity are discouraged. Also, high office requires more than voting rights. It requires connections, and these connections are given to men.
Or in other words, shut up bitch and go make me a sandwich.
More than women. Also, high office generally requires wealth, and remember, wealth is concentrated in men far more than women. There are a number of obstacles that prevent equal power, and the vote alone cannot overcome them all. Remember that Plato quote about women staying at home? It's from 385 BC. That was well over 2,000 years ago and obviously outdated, but is it remarkably different from what many men believe and say today? It is almost word for word what discredited but still popular figures tell impressionable young men every day in 2022. Remember that Tacitus quote lamenting even marginal progress in women's education? From where we are, but is it remarkably different from every back in the old days speech from a...
Wow, and this from Matt Gatz, and it reads, how many of the women rallying against overturning Roe are overeducated, underloved millennials who sadly return from protests to a lonely microwave dinner with their cats and no Bumble matches? Huh? Girl.
Man crying about women's achievements? The world has progressed, but patriarchy has not vanished. It has simply adapted. Why is it still like this? Why must young girls be seen as less bright? Why must young girls be seen as working much harder than young boys to be viewed only as their relative equal? Why are grown women seen as less capable leaders and politicians despite the resounding evidence to the contrary? Because that is how the implicit bias works. It is passed on over and over through billions of people. The first generation to create a male-centered society passed on this bias to their children, not even necessarily through lessons, but through exposure to the male-centered society itself. By age 6, they assume that this is what the world is. and the male-centered society does not work towards pushing back against this perception and deprogramming these children, because the male-centered society is run by the previous children who had the same exposure, whose parents were the children before them, and so on for thousands of years. It's not only something that is taught, it is something to which they are exposed. Other prejudices are passed on as well, but the implicit bias of patriarchy is different. A racial prejudice in one nation will be different in another nation due to the demographics. This is also true of religious prejudice in different nations and cultures. But the implicit bias of patriarchy exists in every nation because of the population. So it ends up being global. I prefer to see myself as a modern person, but even I catch myself from time to time behaving or thinking in such a way that is a result of this exposure.
Same here, yeah.
Nobody is entirely immune, not even women who do not benefit from these values. Male-centered society throughout history might be best understood as the inheritance of wealth. When inheriting great wealth, a small percentage of society acquires enormous capital through no accomplishment except birthright, and this capital may or may not continue into the next generation and the next after that. The product of economic inequality is an economic hierarchy. Now, the inheritance of male-centered society allows a social capital to be acquired by approximately half the population through birthright, and this inheritance can never be completely spent. There is too much of it, and so many people have it that there will always be enough to pass on to the next generation, and the next, and the next, and it will always go to the same half of the population. In the same way hoarding wealth creates enormous income inequality, hoarding this social capital creates enormous social inequality. The product of social inequality is a social hierarchy, and this social hierarchy is called patriarchy. Let's conclude this section. The modern perception of women as less than men, or under the care of men, or under the authority of men, has its origins in sexual violence and slavery. This violence and denial of autonomy has not actually vanished, only changed. Today, the hierarchy of gender continues to persist in service of limiting the autonomy of women. Now that we know how patriarchy functions, we should examine a specific topic related to patriarchy. I am dedicating an entire video in this mini-series to the recent Supreme Court decision, the history of abortion laws in the United States, and more broadly, the subject of autonomy. I'm not done with patriarchy, but this requires its own video. It's simply too big for this one. That's coming next time, and it's coming soon.
All right, y'all. So we've just dealt with the origins of toxic patriarchy, what that means, how it was created through, again, slavery and the control of women, and how all of these attributes that were believed about women are still reverberating energetically to this day, and how there are women who statistically, factually, like, we have to take this into account, especially if we're going to be comprehensible, balanced individuals, right? And be intellectually honest instead of being dishonest. Women and those who are oppressed, unfortunately, have to work 2, 3, 4 times as hard, and even their works are still questioned. I recently watched a video by an individual by the name of Think Peace Tribe. Shout out to him. And one of his most recent videos in reference to affirmative action, and how he has also gotten black women together and got some of their commentary, educated black women who were able to go to these prestigious places of academia because of their skills and their talents and their intellect. And even when they got to these places that were predominantly white and predominantly male, all of a sudden they're questioning why she is there. Oh, you're here because of affirmative action. If you look at my transcript, if you look at my testing, you see that I'm actually here because of my intellect. But affirmative action gives me the opportunity to be in these spaces, not just because I'm black or a person of color, but because I have intellect. And a lot of times I'm more intellectual than you. But then if we were to look at it realistically on the other side, a lot of those people in those very prestigious schools, their intellect and IQ is low as hell. And the reason why they're there is because of money and lineage. Oh, my father donated a library. Oh, my father donated money to the school. Oh, my father donated a statue. And now all of a sudden, next semester, their child is sitting in the class. So they got in. But it wasn't their intellect. It was, again, the resources and the money. All this shit that we are showing and people are still choosing to ignore it, they're intellectually dishonest and we need to call them out. Call these people the fuck out. Now, we're going to get into part 2 of this live, okay? Which talks about toxic masculinity. And again, it's from the Renegade cut. Both links to those videos, again, are in the description box below that you can check out in your leisure time or without my commentary. But we're going to get into toxic masculinity and how that is one of the byproducts or the extensions of toxic patriarchy, the policing of men to make sure that men continue these ideas and ideologies, right, of suppressing other people. And if men start operating out of what society deems as a man, you will be chastised, you will be made fun of, and possibly destroyed. And he's going to use the film Conan the Barbarian starring Arnold Schwarzenegger as an example. And this was actually one of the first videos that I came across in reference to the Renegade cut, because he would take movies and give film essays and bring the social economic aspect to it that made a lot of sense. So we're almost halfway done. We got this video, and then I have one more video to show that's very, very quick. That is a question to all men, especially those who believe in toxic patriarchy and masculinity. Okay, so let's get into toxic masculinity.
Masculinity is a set of attributes, values, and behaviors associated with being a man. It is a social construct that is distinct from biological sex. The term toxic masculinity refers to a specific societal expectation of men that is enforced and policed by men. A narrow, inflexible script of being a man that emphasizes reliance on aggressive behavior, de-emphasizes other more positive traits that are sometimes coded masculine, and dismisses any and all traits for men that are coded feminine. It also refers to the incredible and damaging pressure to behave this way in order to achieve or maintain their status as men. When the term toxic masculinity is used, it is not an assertion that men are naturally violent. It is also not an assertion that all aspects of masculinity are naturally toxic. Confronting toxic elements of masculinity often runs into the problem of misunderstanding the concept or ignoring the concept for fear of self-reflection. And this has made defining what toxic masculinity is not as important as defining what it is. I'm going to be spending a lot of time in this video trying to get people over the hurdle of what is and is not toxic masculinity, because that seems to be the biggest roadblock in the discourse. Here are some common bad arguments so that we don't have to deal with them in the comments. You think men are toxic. You think masculinity is toxic. No. The term toxic masculinity does not refer to all masculinity being toxic, nor is it a condemnation of men or manhood. It refers to a form of masculinity, not all masculinity. Most who reject toxic masculinity would conversely praise other traits that society often codes as masculine, like courage and protectiveness. The Good Men Project describes it thusly. Toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designating manhood as defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. It's the cultural ideal of manliness, where strength is everything while emotions are a weakness, where sex and brutality are yardsticks by which men are measured, while supposedly feminine traits, which can range from emotional vulnerability to simply not being hypersexual, are the means by which your status as man can be taken away. Toxic masculinity positions masculinity in general as superior to femininity, reinforcing a vertical hierarchy. A vertical hierarchy is an unequal social or economic institution or structure. The term toxic masculinity is designed to describe not masculinity itself, but a form of gendered behavior that occurs when expectations of manliness go wrong. Put even more simply, everyone on the Boston Red Sox are Major League Baseball players, but not all Major League Baseball players are Boston Red Sox.
Exactly.
Some of them are Blue Jays and Yankees and such. Nobody is calling all baseball players the Red Sox, and nobody is calling every expression of masculinity toxic. It should be noted, however, that this absolutely does not mean that there exist toxic men and non-toxic men, as if they are neatly divided up like baseball teams. It means that some behavior is toxic and some behavior is not. Everyone is susceptible to negative behavior traits, even those making a conscious effort not to do so. We should call it something besides toxic masculinity. Perhaps by calling toxic masculinity something else, we could make men less defensive when discussing it, right? No such luck. The term patriarchy sounds fairly neutral and scientific in language and contains no scary words like toxic, but when the topic of patriarchy is brought up, the same men who dismiss the concept of toxic masculinity cry out and dismiss patriarchy as well. The word is not the problem. The words could be anything, and the same defensiveness would occur. If we changed the word toxic to something less harsh like bad, the same people who exclaim, "Oh, so you think all men are toxic?" would instead say, "Oh, so you think all men are bad?" Hegemonic masculinity describes a form of masculinity that is narrow, but not specifically toxic masculinity. Traditional masculinity ideology describes some of what toxic masculinity is, but does not describe it specifically enough and encompasses other things that would muddy the waters. Not to mention the fact that it is not immediately positioned as a negative in its wording. Also, jargon terms that require a second definition just to understand the meaning of one of the words do not lend themselves to educating the masses. They are more helpful in academic settings. Furthermore, again, even this academic term would eventually be rejected by the same people who reject the term patriarchy. Some attempts to use a different term are meant in good faith as a means of making it more palatable, though that seems an unlikely result, and some attempts are made in bad faith in hopes of removing discussion about toxic masculinity altogether. Men invented the car, you know. Listing men's achievements is irrelevant because nobody is dismissing said achievements or attacking men.
Right.
What about toxic femininity? The early feminist movement wrote a lot about what we might now call toxic femininity, meaning the results of society placing a great deal of pressure on women to look and behave in a similarly idealized way. Example, eating disorders. You can't fool me, I'm a man who goes his own way, and the fact that the term toxic masculinity has a qualifier, toxic, is evidence in and of itself that those who use the term either in academic settings or in conversation do not believe all masculinity is toxic, because that's how words work. Men who believe this are new male, beta male soy cucks. Please
Come on, man,
say
language.
this or some variant of this in the comments if you want to expose yourself and prove toxic masculinity definitely exists. The point of toxic masculinity is that it makes men see anything less than the aggressive, uncaring ideal of masculinity as worthless and the subject of ridicule, thus putting unnecessary pressure on men to perform this version of masculinity. If you want to prove toxic masculinity exists, please go ahead and say this, as it is the most blatant example and proof of toxic masculinity. The policing of what is and is not properly masculine. All caught up? Excellent.
Hell no,
Let's
they ain't
talk
caught
about
up.
Conan
They
the
caught on
Barbarian.
shit.
In Conan the Barbarian, young Conan's parents are slaughtered by the forces of Thulsa Doom. Conan becomes a slave, but his strenuous physical exercise eventually transforms himself into Arnold Schwarzenegger. He becomes a gladiator, then a thief, and then exacts revenge on Thulsa Doom and his serpent cult. Conan was not born violent, but he was taught by his father that the only thing he can trust is his sword, and the circumstances of his life, a system of enslavement, hardened him and made him the violent barbarian. Men are not born with toxic attitudes or born violent. They are taught by others explicitly, or taught implicitly through social interactions with other men that express this narrow form of masculinity. These social systems are not literally pushing the wheel of pain endlessly until it makes you hard and unfeeling, but, well, it's a pretty solid metaphor, right? Conan had no choice but to push the wheel and exist in this strict hierarchical system. He did not choose this, and the system predated himself. Most people are not slaves, but all exist within vertical hierarchies that do us a lot of damage, and much like Conan, we have no choice but to participate in them. In this iconic scene, Conan is asked what is best in life.
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women.
What Conan is describing here actually fits quite well with the description of the values of toxic masculinity. Crush your enemies. Alright, so aggression. A component of toxic masculinity is the expectation that men, real men, are strong. Not only physically strong like Conan, but emotionally strong. However, in this narrow version of masculinity, emotionally strong means unemotional. Emotion becomes incompatible with being strong. Anger is considered an exception to the rule or not labeled an emotion at all. Example, Conan understandably grieves the loss of his love interest. Another character claims that Conan cannot cry, so he will cry for him. In this narrow version of masculinity, Conan's unemotional response to the loss of his romantic partner is seen as noble, even though it benefits no one, least of all Conan, to suppress his feelings. In general, women live longer than men. Scientists have tried to determine why this is for a long time. There are a lot of factors that play into this, and I will leave a link in the description for further reading, but relevant to the topic today, one factor that causes men bodily harm is stress. According to a study from last year, work stress is 6 times more likely to kill men than women, despite being otherwise healthy. Why is this? Well, everyone puts pressure on themselves, but men are told by society that being strong and not expressing your feelings in a healthy way are both positive traits. In truth, keeping your feelings inside causes added stress. Toxic masculinity can be harmful to women if men are given the impression that aggression is a positive, but it is also harmful to men who are given the impression that expressing your feelings in a healthy manner is weak. This pressure to be strong all the time can cause adverse health effects. It's not the only reason there is a gap in mortality between men and women, but it appears to be one contributing factor. So what else does Conan say? See them driven before you. Okay, so pride? There is nothing about being a man that means having to see oneself as larger than life, but toxic masculinity makes it difficult to feel secure about being merely average when our vertical hierarchies demand control and competition. And the last thing Conan says? Hear the lamentations of the women. Okay, so let's talk about that. Conan, encountering women, mindlessly calls them sluts. In another scene, Conan is gifted a woman who clearly does not want to have sex with Conan. Toxic masculinity tells men that they should be prepared for sex at any time, and that it is only natural to believe oneself entitled to the attention of women.
For example, like when men see a woman that they find attractive outside on the streets, walking past, and they, oh, hey, you fine, beautiful, what's your name, whoop-de-whoop-de-woo, and she says she's not interested. There's not no, oh, okay, that's cool, no problem, enjoy yourself, queen, whoop-de-woo. It ain't none of that. It's, oh, you bitch, fuck you, you ugly anyway, you dumb. It's all these insults. Because they didn't get what they wanted. Because we live in a society like he just said, that tells men that they need to be prepared for sex at any moment. The more sex a man has with women, the more of the man he is, the more of the Mac he is, the more of the pimp that he is, desirable he is.
The toxic script says that if men think about sex all the time, then that is the natural course they must take, and that men therefore must be extremely forward about sex. That sex is an inevitability, mandatory, and can skirt around the borders of consent. You can imagine how women feel about this sexual aggression, especially when it is justified as, boys will be boys. Under this narrow scope, if violence is an indicator of power, then violence against women is acceptable if it's in service of men's so-called natural desires. According to the American Psychiatric Association, more than any biological reason, these cultural lessons are what link men to aggression and violence. This leaves boys and men at disproportionate risk for school discipline, academic challenges, health disparities, and substance abuse. Men are also overrepresented in prisons and are significantly more likely to commit violent crimes than women. Again, this is not because violence is natural for men, but because of this social script of toxic masculinity. Also, because of the competitive nature of toxic masculinity, aggression between men is a contributing factor to men being at greater risk of being the victims of violent crime as well. You know how Conan the Barbarian is pretty good and the sequel, Conan the Destroyer, is pretty bad? Well, saying the first one is good and the second one needs some work does not mean someone hates the Conan movies. Comparatively, saying some aspects of what we consider masculinity are positive and some aspects of what we consider masculinity are negative does not mean that someone hates men. If you can understand and accept someone liking Conan the Barbarian but not Conan the Destroyer, you can understand someone appreciating men but not like men abusing women. So, where did all of this come from?
Right.
If toxic masculinity is such a destructive...
Now, keep in mind that this video is a little bit, I want to say maybe a year or 2 years off, possibly 3 years off from the first video we saw about toxic patriarchy, because once again, that was a more extensive breakdown. So he's going to give his opinion, or not even his opinion. I'm sorry, it's not opinion, but fact and his scholastic understanding of patriarchy at that time. Okay, I just wanted to put that out there.
Force, then how did it propagate itself? Part of what we have come to call toxic masculinity is the belief that physical strength separates men from women and therefore makes men superior, or at least superior at things that matter. Men who believe this often deflect by calling women their partners but still believe that the workforce and important positions should be dominated by men. This hierarchy, most historians and experts say, began to happen when human beings started to raise livestock. The first known patriarchies were nomadic herding societies, meaning the first to depend on raising livestock, and that male privilege and women's oppression reached their height in advanced agrarian societies that depended heavily on both human labor and animal breeding. Vertical hierarchies of economy were created by those who hoarded the most wealth. That's not to say that this happened everywhere. Anthropological and historical studies of societies in Africa, pre-Columbian North America, and New Guinea show numerous cultures in which women had not been devalued or pushed down the hierarchy. Matrilineal societies are historically quite common and have included significant female control over land and property. Sexual violence and treatment of women as property were largely unknown in these societies, and historically only increased with the introduction of male dominance, often from outside cultures. Like many societal woes, toxic masculinity has its roots in vertical power structures. Hierarchies that elevate some people, often not based on true merit, but pre-existing systems that benefit them, and disenfranchise others often for reasons beyond the control of those disenfranchised. Hierarchies are not held together peacefully, as the circumstances in which they were created and maintained involve the exploitation of those lower on the ladder. Hierarchies are held together by force. Capitalism, for example, is maintained by a ruling economic class that exploits workers. Those who defend these hierarchies claim that they are natural and that makes them somehow unavoidable. Of course, no hierarchical system has always existed, which disproves this, and even if it were natural, something being natural does not make it automatically better. Indoor plumbing is not natural, but we wouldn't give that up. It's not a coincidence that those who defend the existence of these hierarchies, whether based in economics, race, gender, etc., are also those who benefit most from them. Hierarchies create incredibly stressful competition, which often guides those in said hierarchies to double down on the worst aspects of the condition that keeps them above others. In the case of male hierarchy over women, this competition makes men resistant to challenges to masculinity. Thus, when men are told about toxic masculinity and the dangers to both women and themselves, they often dismiss said criticisms and engage in the behavior even further. Challenging toxic masculinity can make some men take on even more toxic traits, because humans living in hierarchical systems have been conditioned to be competitive. If masculinity is what makes them male, and being male is a higher position in the gender hierarchy, then criticism of masculinity feels like an affront and a challenge to said position. Even though criticisms of toxic masculinity are intended to help and not hurt men, the criticism is mistakenly perceived as an attack, even when this criticism is brought up by other men, because men are not only competing against women, but also competing among other men. This is true in other hierarchies as well. When capitalism is criticized for the disparity between the rich and poor, capitalists counter by demanding even fewer regulations and even more tax cuts for the rich, thus increasing the disparity between the rich and poor rather than resolving it. If the hierarchy between men and women is so resistant to change, what can we do to better the situation? Well, the truth is, on an individual level, power structures like gender hierarchies cannot be dismantled by your individual growth on the subject. Your growth is important, both to yourself and to those with whom you interact, but it will do nothing to the hierarchy itself. Your personal growth is not the end of toxic masculinity or this hierarchy. It is only education about toxic masculinity and this hierarchy.
Yeah.
That's definitely a good thing, but it is the start and not the end of the journey. I don't want that to sound discouraging, though. There is some good that can and should be done on the individual level. Some things can be done, like actively pushing back when telling your friends, family, and coworkers when they are engaging in toxic behavior. And I recommend this wholeheartedly, but that still is not the end of the journey. Combating toxic masculinity is what we can do now within the system in which we currently exist, and we should. But obviously the system itself needs to change. Powerful, far-reaching structures and attitudes can only be dismantled or at least diminished through powerful, far-reaching movements like direct action, drastically changing education on the matter taught from an early age, and working toward changing vertical hierarchies in other aspects of life. The world needs to work toward horizontal leadership in all forms and eliminate the obsession with competition in order for any of these hierarchies to completely lose their power, especially since these hierarchies feed into each other. And if you are asking me for an exact plan on how to do this, I hate to disappoint, but I am an educator and not an organizer. I don't have a blueprint to change the world. Although education is the first step, and I hope that this video has been more helpful than harmful.
Yeah.
To recap, toxic masculinity is a hegemonic form of masculinity that protects aggression and unemotional detachment, and it defines manhood in narrow terms while de-emphasizing positive traits that are sometimes coded masculine. It is unhelpful or dangerous to people of all genders and is empowered by a rigid, vertical hierarchy that has existed for centuries. Said hierarchy can't be taken down overnight. We can't just cut off the head of Thulsa Doom and change the world with one stroke. But within the current system we have, we should always make an effort to minimize harm and affect change where we can.
All right, y'all, and that was part 2 explaining what toxic masculinity is in a more scholastic, academic, and hopefully comprehensible way in order for people to truly, genuinely understand what's going on. What's going on, Deshaun? What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? Now that we have all that information, now that we have the education, now that we have the facts, now that we have a stronger idea of what these things are, and like he said at the end of that video, individual growth alone is not going to be the end-all be-all. It is a start. Because in order to change the world, you have to be the change that you seek. And that if we come together and heal from these experiences collectively, then we will be able to make a change. And the last video that I want to show is very quick. I might play it twice because it's like a minute or so. It's a question to all men, especially those who participate in toxic patriarchy and masculinity. And I've asked this before, and I will ask it. Well, another black cis hetero man will ask the question. Maybe it will be more relatable hearing it from him as opposed from me. And here's the question.
How would you describe your masculinity outside of the context of women? That's one. Two, as a man, how would you describe your masculinity outside of what it is that you can perform? Number three, as a man, outside of your ability to be powerful, outside of your ability of sexual prowess, how would you describe your masculinity? So literally, if we remove the pleasures of the flesh, who are you? Where's your spirit? Where's your mind? And a lot of brothers will lie in order to save their egos. They are more comforted in the lie of their masculinity instead of the reality of their boyhood. And that's okay.
Now I'm going to play that one more time with my mic on, because I'm going to give all type of I'm going to give all type of that. One more time. Here is the question.
As a man, how would you describe your masculinity outside of the context of women? That's one. Two, as a man, how would you describe your masculinity outside of what it is that you can perform? Number three, as a man, outside of your ability to be powerful, outside of your ability of sexual prowess, how would you describe your masculinity? So literally, if we remove the pleasures of the flesh, who are you? Where's your spirit? Where's your mind? And a lot of brothers will lie in order to save their egos.
Wow.
They are more comforted in the lie of their masculinity instead of the reality of their boyhood. And that's okay.
I want to play it just one more time. He's asking outside of these things, outside of toxic patriarchy, outside of toxic masculinity. How can you describe masculinity outside of those things that toxic masculinity depends on? Who are you as an individual and as a person? Third time's the charm.
As a man, how would you describe your masculinity outside of the context of women? That's one. Two, as a man, how would you describe your masculinity outside of what it is that you can perform?
Outside of that.
Number three, as a man, outside of your ability to be powerful, outside of your ability of sexual prowess, how would you describe your masculinity? So literally, if we remove the pleasures of the flesh, who are you? Where's your spirit? Where's your mind? And a lot of brothers will lie in order to save their egos. They are more comforted in the lie of their masculinity instead of the reality of their boyhood. And that's okay.
And I wonder if any of those men will answer that question. And matter of fact, I'm a bold ass nigga. I've always been that. So after I get done editing and I put this on Rumble, I'm going to tag some people. I'm going to tag some channels. And I want them to answer the question. Again, in closing, we live in the information age where we have the opportunity to control our narrative and the agency of our experience. The fact that there is this rigid mold that is being taught to men and women being a part of it, not in a way that's beneficial or that's healthy or that's equal, but in a way to stand upon something else to feel better about yourself or to be higher than someone else. I want y'all to understand. And this is spirit speaking. Universal spirit speaking. There will come a time where all of those monolithic, toxic ass views will be called into question. And will be brought forth to the forefront under the microscope of truth and justice. And you will have the opportunity to actually walk in your truth. Because those structures will be torn apart, and only what is true and genuine and honest will remain. How will your ego deal with that? I've said it before, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it until I draw my last breath. There will be equality across the board. We have the opportunity right here and right now to reconcile and to do things differently. And if we don't do things differently, something will happen to all of us to where we will end up feeling guilty and having full of shame because we didn't take the opportunity to actually make things right with everybody. Because our ego prevents us from that. So anyway, I hope y'all enjoyed part 2 of Fear is the Path to the Dark Side. Again, this is part of the Fear series. This time dealing with toxic patriarchy and masculinity, where it conquers everything. Deshaun says toxic masculinity is not going to get them far in life. It's gonna lead to more destruction. It's really not. And toxic masculinity leads back to the Bible, which is Cain, which he taught the people nothing but violence. But these men don't realize that this masculinity that they're talking about is actually Cain talk. I get it. A lot of brothers will lie in order to say whatever of their manhood or save whatever is of their manhood. It's very interesting. I get it now. Yep. Because now spirit wants to know who you are, not know who you are in the context of what society says or what you should do or what you shouldn't do, but know you individually as a person. And we see this, the fact that there are queer men, especially feminine queer men, who are rising and ascending in their life, who have complete control over their narrative and agency over their expression. That these men who believe in toxic patriarchy and masculinity continue to make fun of and demonize as a way, or use them as a barometer to judge their masculinity. And again, I want those men to answer the question that that other cis hetero black man has asked. And I wonder if I'll ever get a true, genuine, comprehensible answer that comes from the spirit and not from the ego. But the thing is, people like negativity and they follow it, so men don't know what masculinity is, and they followed some man that was hypersexual, and that's what they go by him. They go by the man that is very negative and very sexual, and that is what masculinity is, and that's not what it is. That is totally wrong and false. All I'm doing is providing the information. Again, don't take my word for it. Don't take the Renegade Cut's word for it. Study to show thyself approved. So thank y'all so much for rocking with me with this live. Shout out to Deshaun in the building. Shout out to King Rico who came through. Shout out to Boy Crazy. Shout out to those in the bushes. Shout out to those in the replay gang, please make sure that you hit the like button, please, because that will help this channel grow in the algorithms. That is possibly the best thing that you can do on this channel. If you're liking the vibe and the energy here on BubzDaGawd and you like the Bubs flow, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the notification bell, and make sure that bell is clicked to all so that you can be alerted of my uploads. Okay? And if you feel compelled, please go ahead and donate to the Leprechaun Ministry, where we actually put door knobs on the door. Okay? Through CashApp, $BubzDaGawd. I really appreciate it. Make sure that y'all please share this video. I also give permission for anyone to use this video for their own commentary, whether you agree, whether you're in opposition, whether you're on the fence. I give you the permission. I can't sit up here and use other people's content for commentary and then feel some type of way if someone else does the same thing to me. Again, it's equality across the board, and I have to accept that as well. Okay? And until next time, y'all, peace.
Love never dies, just choose to be born.